Hi. Last week the Hamilton City Council voted on whether Hamilton should declare a climate emergency or whether the council should acknowledge the need for climate urgency or do nothing about climate change. The council ultimately decided on climate urgency rather than an emergency, which is better than nothing. But I'm not here to talk about the outcome. This video is about addressing some of the comments made by councillors in the debate and hopefully educating them, or perhaps more likely, giving people talking to them or people like them some tools in dealing with the stupid comments that they made, or ones similar to them. So the council debate was longish. I'll link to it down below. The actual debate starts at 2 hours and 5 minutes and is preceded by comments from members of the public. Fortunately, I'm not going to address everything said. I mostly want to speak to comments from councillors James Casson, Gary Mallett and Leo Tooman, as well as Michelle Walker, one of the commenters who informed their arguments. So let's jump straight into James Casson's comments. James is currently running for mayor, so maybe pay close attention to this.
Thank you, Mayor Andrew. I can't support the amendment. I listened to Michelle Walker today, who was probably the most qualified person here, Earth Sciences to master's degree level. Look, climate change is happening, but it's cyclic. It has happened on Earth right through time, since the time of dinosaurs, right to modern day, many, many times.
Current climate change is part of a natural cycle and implying that we shouldn't do anything about it. Of course, this is completely wrong. He is correct that there are natural climate cycles driven by changes in the planet's orbit. But the contemporary climate change is not a result of this. To illustrate this, here is a graph of the global average temperature over the last 450,000 years. The top two lines are the temperature from ice core samples. The bottom line is the amount of ice on Earth, with up being low levels of ice and down being high levels of ice, just to be confusing. As you can see, the temperature changes fairly regularly as the planet goes in and out of ice ages. A slow, gradual decline in temperature followed by a rapid increase in temperature. However, on the right you have the present day, and you can see that the natural warming phase ended about 10,000 years ago. And we are supposed to be in a gradual cooling phase right now, with about 40,000 years to go until the climate starts warming again. However, this graph can't really show the current climate change, since the past 100 years is nothing on a graph of 450,000 years. So let's look at the last 2,000 years to see the issue. In this graph, you can't really see the long-term trend since the time frame is too short. But on the far right, you can see the thing that has people concerned. The black line is the global average temperature, shooting up from about 1850 onwards. There are two things that tell us this is not natural. Firstly, in the natural cycle, we are supposed to be cooling right now. Over the last 450,000 years, there was never a time when temperature increased, paused for 10,000 years, and then started rising again, which is what is happening right now. Secondly, climate change has never happened this rapidly. You saw average temperature increases quickly as Earth comes out of an ice age. The current temperature increase is happening around 10 times faster than those changes. This is not natural. So for James's benefit, yes, there are natural climate cycles, but we have broken them.
And look, using facts and data from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they even confirm that CO2 levels were 15 times higher than the 400 parts per million in the past.
So in the distant past, carbon dioxide levels were higher. James doesn't specify when he is talking about, but the kind of figures he is citing must be pre-Cambrian CO2 levels, back when Earth only contained single-celled life forms. And just to demonstrate that he misses the point, in the Cambrian period, when CO2 concentrations were 10 times higher than they are today, the Earth was significantly hotter, had little to no ice, sea levels were much higher, despite the fact that the sun was significantly less intense in that time period. However, humans, our society, and the other life forms that exist today are not adapted for pre-Cambrian climates. They are all adapted for modern climates and won't cope with a pre-Cambrian world. It is also worth noting that articles like the one in Nature linked below suggest that if we continue with current rates of greenhouse gas emissions, we could reach pre-Cambrian levels by the year 2050. 2500. However, that will never happen because there is no way our society could adapt to these kind of climatic changes happening that quickly while maintaining a modern industrial economy. Also, to reiterate my previous point about the speed of which change is happening, it took 300 million years of natural CO2 changes to go from 4,000-ish ppm to 300-ish ppm. We might go from 300-ish at the start of the Industrial Revolution to 4,000-ish within 400 years. Again, the changes we are seeing are not natural and they are not precedented.
And that CO2 is actually not a bad thing. It is the molecule of life. It actually is required by plants right across from forests, food crops and jungles. If CO2 levels are dropped to zero, that's going to be a huge problem for us.
James talks about how carbon dioxide is good for plants, the implication being that more carbon dioxide is better for plants. This isn't as true as it might first sound, because of the way plants absorb carbon dioxide, most of them won't benefit from increased atmospheric CO2. It's kind of complicated to explain, so I won't bother here, but I will link a video in the comments below that will explain this all if you're interested. I want to put it in simple logical terms. Plants have adapted over millions of years to our current atmosphere. Changing the atmosphere suddenly is going to have negative effects for most plants, since it would no longer be the conditions they have evolved to live in. Obviously. He also says that if CO2 levels were to drop to zero, that would be a problem. Which is true. Good thing that people aren't asking for zero carbon in the atmosphere. We're asking for net zero carbon emissions, i.e., a stable level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Awesome. The next part of James's speech is particularly brain dead. He points out that carbon is basically not a poison, and that there are lots of things that are good, that are made out of carbon. Which of course everyone already knew, and people are not concerned. It's only greenhouse gases that cause issues for climate change, in particular methane and carbon dioxide, both of which contain carbon. No one is in any way worried by the fact that babies contain carbon. I'll include a short clip of this thing.
So people denouncing carbon as an evil pollutant, they're eating carbon, drinking carbon, smoking carbon, and even making babies made of carbon.
James makes one more claim. He thinks that adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere actually decreases global temperatures.
So look, the 2013 NASA Langley Research Centre debunked global warming as studies showed that CO2 actually helps cool the atmosphere as 95% of solar radiation is bounced back into space.
I couldn't find where he got his information from. I went to the NASA Langley website and this discovery wasn't in their top achievements of 2013. I think he's describing half of the greenhouse effect. I'm not sure where the 95% figure comes from, but in reality the atmosphere and clouds reflect about a quarter of the sun's energy out into space, which does cool the planet down as greenhouse gases increase. However, the 75% of energy that reaches the Earth is radiated into the atmosphere at a different wavelength than the incoming solar energy, and greenhouse gases are way more effective at blocking these wavelengths, so increasing greenhouse gases results in less energy reaching Earth, but even more energy being trapped within the atmosphere. So, yeah, he's only describing half the process. That is enough from James. Let's go over to Leo Tooman, who makes the claim that climate change is natural.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Andrew. Interesting this morning there where Michelle, who's got 6 years study in earth science, she started with, naturally changing climate is not an emergency. And yet Joss came in and he had a different view. So I'm just wondering whether they both went to the same university or what happened there. To me, I think what we have to do is we have to take notice of our scientists and our geologists, and it's far easier just to deal with the facts. Sea levels, apparently 125,000 years ago, were 140 metres higher than they are today. And from what I can ascertain is Florida Keys, for example, is the remains of a coral reef that grew back in those days.
So his statement is that 125,000 years ago, sea levels were 140 metres higher than they are today. Again, the implication being that climate change is all natural and we shouldn't worry too much about it, and yeah. However, he's wrong about this. Firstly, sea levels were 8 metres higher 125,000 years ago, not 140 metres, so he's slightly off there. But let's bring back the chart of temperature over the last 450,000 years. We can see here that 125,000 years ago, known as the Eemian period, was actually the warmest point in the last 450,000 years. In fact, at this point in time, changes in Earth's orbit meant that the Arctic was about 2 to 4 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial norm, and there was therefore no sea ice in the Arctic Circle, leading to a much higher sea level. It's worth pointing out that the last few years have surpassed the global average temperature of the Eemian, and we are seeing high rates of Arctic and Antarctic ice melting. So again, this isn't natural, but even if it was, it will still be bad. As Leo says, if the polar ice caps melt, Florida would be underwater. Lots of people live there, and there are also lots of other places that would be underwater. This is going to be a bad thing, and we should try to stop it. The last of the councillors to look at is Gary Mallett, who was just willfully ignorant.
And I acknowledge I'm not a climate scientist, but I do know, and everyone in this room knows, that the climate has changed, the climate is changing, and the climate will always change. And the challenge for us is what we do to respond to that. I am still not convinced that that the two tenets here, that mankind is creating this environmental change, and that mankind can do anything to stop it, or naff all to stop it. I mean, we've all heard examples of the example when White Island blows up, or a volcano somewhere else around the world blows up. That's all your climate change mitigations blown away in 1 minute. So there's a limit to what mankind can do. I have to say that the process has been a bit disturbing, not so much today, but when the kids came along the first time, we had children, smart, articulate, sincere kids up there in tears, because these kids have been, and I won't say brainwashed, that's a bit derogatory, but these kids are genuinely concerned that there's no point them having kids, there's no point them continuing on with their education, because the world ain't going to exist. Well, that patently is incorrect. And so we need to be very, very careful that we're not scaremongering here. This whole debate screams out for proper cost-benefit analysis, and by that I mean, I'll just use a bit of a slogan that, you know, the cure could be, and I am sure, or I'm very, very concerned, could be way worse than the disease, and there has been no work done on that anywhere within the world, as far as I can see.
Of course, everything that Gary's uncertain about has been demonstrated, cost-benefit analysis have been done, and Gary just doesn't want to look at the evidence. As he said, he is sure that the cure will be worse than the disease, despite the fact that he hasn't seen any cost-benefit analysis on preventing climate change. But there is one more person to discuss. You would have heard Michelle Walker mentioned twice by name, and Gary repeats one of her arguments. She was one of the initial speakers from the public. She has a master's degree in earth sciences, so her ideas should be robust enough to withstand my critique, since I only have a master's in sociology. The start of her speech is kind of empty rhetoric. She casually dismisses the predictive ability of scientists because predictions aren't evidence, before she heads into a fact dump.
Climate is more complicated than the politicians would have you believe, but I will do my best to give you my version in this short time. Let's start with the same question I asked the bureaucrats at the Farmers' Public Meeting about the emissions trading scheme on Friday 26th of July 2019. Maybe you can answer it for me because they couldn't. I would like to know why New Zealand is ignoring the Paris Agreement, which states that emissions need to be reduced without reducing food supply, because this is what our largest industry will have to do to comply. Carbon dioxide and methane are emitted by cattle, rice paddy fields, wetlands, termites, which are the largest emitters on the planet. Decomposing life hydrates petroleum leaks, rocks, mid-ocean ridges, sedimentation, soil bacteria, earthquakes and volcanoes. Carbon dioxide makes up 0.39% of the atmosphere. New Zealand's contributions are 0.056% of this 0.39%. Methane is 0.00017% of the total atmospheric gases. This is negligible on a global scale, so how will reducing New Zealand's very, very, very low emissions have any influence on the global climate without affecting food supply and the economy?
I haven't bothered to look any of those facts up, but I'll assume it's all true. But it's also all irrelevant. The fact that carbon dioxide is released from a lot of natural activities that humans don't cause is true, but the carbon emissions that human activities release are on top of those natural processes, and it is much easier to switch to wind power and public transport than it is to get volcanoes and earthquakes to stop happening. She points out that agriculture produces greenhouse gases, which is true, but it does so at varying rates depending on agricultural practices. In order to lower carbon emissions while maintaining food output, we will have to transition to more carbon-efficient forms of food production. And that's it. As for affecting the economy to create a sustainable future is kind of the point of doing things about climate change. And I almost forgot about you saying that small numbers of greenhouse gases mean that this is not an issue. And we couldn't make a meaningful change anyway because New Zealand's number is even smaller, which is obviously a very flawed argument. I'll do an analogy. Currently, in the United States of America, 0.0006% of the population are serial killers. Obviously, this is just an insignificant proportion of the population, so they couldn't possibly commit harm to the rest of society, and it really isn't worth affecting the economy by raising taxes to hire police to track them down. In fact, those police could find work as farmers producing more food. By extrapolating this to the rest of the world, only 0.000036% of the world's total population would be serial killers in New Zealand. Therefore, New Zealand can't meaningfully contribute to the global serial killer problem, and we shouldn't even try since that would disrupt the economy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that just because a number is small doesn't mean it's insignificant. Also, if you want to claim this isn't a fair analogy, since serial killers directly harm people, I'll agree. Climate change only causes more extreme weather events, which then cause direct harm to people. I'll run through the rest of her speech for completeness' sake and because I don't want to misrepresent what she says.
Let's look at how science works. Consensus is not science. The media views science as a popularity contest in which those with the greatest numbers wins. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. Adolf Hitler once sought to discredit the work of Albert Einstein by commissioning a paper called 100 Scientists Against Einstein. Einstein responded rightly, "If I were wrong, one would have been enough." If there is a hypothesis that human emissions create global warming, then in science only one item of evidence is needed to show that this hypothesis is wrong. The following geological facts will disprove the theory of anthropogenic global warming more than once. Science is never settled. What drives climate change? This is a very complicated question. The best answer is that climate change derives from a combination of orbital, solar, terrestrial, and extraterrestrial processes. Many times they interact. There are still many things we do not know about climate, and new processes are continually being discovered, and therefore the science is not settled. The IPCC itself shows that the science is not settled, that there is no consensus, and that little is known about the controls on the climate system. In the 2007 IPCC report, the words uncertain and uncertainty is used 1,300 times, and there are 54 key uncertainties. Let's get some perspective. New Zealand's own little volcano, White Island, pumps out 1,150 to 4,120 tonnes of carbon dioxide per day, whereas the average vehicle which burns 2,000 litres of fuel every year releases 4.6 tonne. Scientists estimate that worldwide termites release over 150 million tonne of methane gas into the atmosphere annually, which then turns to carbon dioxide and water. It is estimated that for every human on Earth, there may be 1,000 pounds of termites. Let's look at some facts. Again, how...
So it really is more of the same. She says she has evidence to disprove man-made climate change, but the only thing she presents is the same argument as before, that natural processes also emit methane and carbon dioxide. But again, human emissions occur as well as the natural emissions. For her argument to be true, the total carbon emissions weren't increasing as a result of human activity. You would have to assume that natural emissions were decreasing at the same rate that human emissions were increasing. But people are yet to wipe out termites or stop White Island from releasing gases, so clearly this isn't the case. Also, on the question of science, she basically says that just because most people believe one thing doesn't mean that it is true. But it also doesn't mean that the minority in disagreement is correct either. This is why science relies on evidence rather than opinion, and why it is important there are reports like the IPCC reports that catalogue the evidence for climate change. Speaking of which, she claims that the use of the word uncertain and uncertainty in those reports diminishes them. But to me, it speaks to the honesty of the report writers. When they don't know something, they say so, and yet they still come to the conclusion that humans are causing rapid climate change, despite acknowledging the limits of their knowledge. Also, worth knowing, Michelle is talking about an old version of the report. It was updated in 2014, and a special report was released last year. But I'm guessing Michelle is using the old version because the science has become a lot less uncertain since 2007, and up-to-date research probably wouldn't support her argument. Anyway, it's about time to wrap up this video, so concluding thoughts. What I find really troubling here is that Michelle presented an illogical argument. It was fact-based, but it logically did not address the issue being discussed. I didn't actually need any facts to dispute what she said, except for the fact that she was using an old version of the IPCC report. This means that anyone in that room should have been able to listen to her and realise what she was saying was simply not relevant. Yet 3 of our city's councillors relied on her testimony to a degree in making their decisions. I could say that this is a result of those 3 not being particularly onto it intellectually, but I think it's more likely that all 3 were simply looking for an excuse not to do anything about climate change and didn't want to think critically about what she was saying, since it would give them an excuse to do nothing. This is especially true since James and Leo both added their own poor understanding to the debate, which suggests they've been uncritically looking around for people to say that climate change wasn't an issue before the debate. Honestly, I hope that all three of the councillors in this video will take the time to learn about the issue and realise why they are wrong. But it is 2019, and if the evidence for climate change hasn't convinced you yet, it probably never will. Also, we need councillors who can examine the evidence presented to them and realise when it's logically flawed or irrelevant. Also, ones that are actually willing to act on climate change would be good as well. However, as a final thought, it's also worth remembering that these three were the minority of the council, that the majority voted in favour of climate urgency and developing a climate action plan for the city. Hopefully when the action plan comes back to the council next year, there will be people sitting there willing to work to put it into effect. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks for listening to my little rant. Bye.